Hello, my name is Colonel Eric Megerdoomian, and I'm the Senior Aviation Trainer at the National Training Center. And I've spent about 6 years on 3 different assignments here at NTC, and I've learned quite a bit about how we fight Army aviation, specifically in a LSCO environment. So before I PCS, I want to be able to share these lessons with you, and that there's quite frankly a lot to unpack. So I'm going to break this out into a 3-part series. In this first part, we're going to talk about the distances that aviation operations needs to be prepared to operate at and why, and the impact it has to specifically 2 warfighting functions. The first one being command and control, and the second one sustainment. In the second part, I'm going to talk about the IADS environment. How are we doing and what makes us so successful? But I'm also going to talk about leg day. When we focus on training our maneuver, but we don't focus on training the staff, what are the impacts and how do we get after that? On the third iteration, I'm going to share with you 7 of the most impactful lessons that I've learned while I was at the National Training Center that you can take with you and put in your hip pocket and apply right away in your units. Without going any further into what's coming up in the next videos, I want to dive and spend some time specifically talking about the distances that we're going to have to operate here at NTC. Before I do that, I'm going to take us back to the Gulf War. I take you back there because a lot of people will argue that the Gulf War was not won in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait, and rather it was won in the deserts of the National Training Center. So much like our adversaries did while we were engulfed in the global war on terrorism, we now are studying how our adversaries are fighting. And what we're doing is we're defining what that new operational environment looks like in order for us to be able to win our first battle of our next war. So as we start to study the Indo-PACOM AOR and we take a look at the European Theater of Operations, we're going to talk about contemporary operational environment. And then we're going to talk about what we're observing in the Ukraine before we talk about some risk that we need to discuss. So let's talk about that contemporary operational environment. With the mass proliferation of small tactical and operational type UAS and how much our adversaries have invested into their electronic warfare capabilities and how much they've penetrated into space and cyber domains, we are ultimately faced with that stacked on top of the proliferation of long-range precision munitions, both through UAS or through long-range tube artillery or rocket fire. What we have witnessed is this contemporary operational start to build. But really the birth of it began during the Armenia-Azerbaijan War, where Colonel retired John Antal wrote about it in his book, 7 Seconds to Die. It's nothing more than an autopsy of Armenia's defeat. And this is really important for us to pay attention to because our adversaries have demonstrated that they have all the necessary sensors in every domain for them to also be able to acquire, cue, and attack, so long as they have their desire, the will, or means to be able to do so. If we take the contemporary operational environment and we put that in comparison to what we're seeing in the Ukrainians refuse to place any of their critical enablers within 150 kilometers of FLOT if they are unable to mask those enablers very well across every domain. The main reason for this is because the max effective range of tube artillery, special multi-launch rocket systems, but also the one-way UAS attack drones. Not only have our adversaries invested billions of dollars in order to prevent aviation from enabling the vertical envelopment, they have also spent a tremendous amount of effort in being able to target us on the ground. So right now what we're seeing is our adversaries have placed aviation TAs as the #1 HPTL for them to target on the ground. We are clearly the focal point of their targeted working group, collection, and fires efforts. So as we've talked about the contemporary operational environment, and we've talked about the observations that we're seeing from the Ukraine, now let's talk a little bit about risk. So I'm going to ask you, as leaders in your formation, are we willing to be able to place our aviation TAAs within tube and artillery ranges on such a transparent battlefield? And if so, how do we plan on masking troop and company or battalion or squadron number of aircraft in your TAA? And if we're unable to do that, are we prepared to be able to jump our aviation TAs every 6 to 8 hours in order to increase the protection, but at the cost of our sustainment of our aircraft? I have been unable to figure out how we do that, with one exception, and that's increasing the distance and trying to find a little bit of relative sanctuary. What I'm going to display for you right now on your screen is a map. You have all seen this map. What I want you to do is draw some attention to how small the National Training Center is on that map. As you know, NTC is very large, but the bottom line is it's not big enough to replicate the distances required for us to prevent the incessant need to jump aviation TAAs like our armor or striker battalions can do. So If 150 kilometers from the FLOT represents relative sanctuary, then relative sanctuary is represented by the LA Basin or Las Vegas. So in order for us to be able to seek relative sanctuary, we must be able to operate at these distances with the Army that we have. And so the question I'm going to ask for you is, are you able to operate those distances with the unit that you have? And so this is important because what we're going to talk about now is the construct of the National Training Center and why it's so important and the impact it has. At the National Training Center, we've replicated these distances in order to replicate the operational environment. But to frame this clearly, though, it generates specifically two stresses, and we're going to frame that, in this case, under warfighting functions: command and control, and also sustainment. Sustainment in particular is important. What we're going to start with is the red pen. Our Commander of Operations Group and our CG here at Fort Irwin will always tell you while you're training here at the National Training Center is always start with the red pen. As in, always start planning your operations with the enemy that you're fighting in mind. But I want to add something here to this. Always start with the red pen, but never ever end with sustainment. So it's not written in doctrine, but what I have come to start to see aviation units is a sustainment organization with a requirement for us to be able to fly to accomplish our missions. At these distances, when we are forced to operate 150 plus kilometers away from the FLOT, our ability to push Class 3 and Class 5 becomes our center of gravity. It is our critical capability, requirement, and ultimately our vulnerability as well. And so without a FARP that is forward deployed in support of a BCT or a division in order to enable the distances that we need to operate, we can only provide a very short few critical moments of support before we have to return back to the aviation TAA, and clearly that's insufficient to be able to achieve the effects that we're looking for on the battlefield. I'm going to take us back to the observations that we're seeing here in the box at the National Training Center. Units typically struggle in operationalizing the deployment of that distro platoon. We often struggle in leaving those FARPs in a height site and only pulling them out when they're needed. We often struggle to be able to utilize silent FARPs to mask their presence under the EW spectrum. We struggle in developing a sustainment pace plan with multiple redundant 2-point FARPs rather than one single 6-point FARP. Oftentimes, we also find units struggle in tying in with adjacent units, specifically the Brigade Support Battalion in the vicinity of the BSA. And at home station, we see units rarely place the necessary emphasis in the training of their formations to be able to drive those distances at night under goggles and be able to provide themselves their own protection. Here's what I'm telling you. Ladies and gentlemen, the conditions have absolutely changed. And we are now going back to what it was before the global war on terrorism. Our FARP platoons were and are once again the most critical platoon in your formation because they're the ones who are going to be able to extend your operational reach in order to accomplish the missions that we're going to ask of our aviation task forces. Here's what we can do about it. First thing I want you to do is I want you to rewind and I want you to pay attention to those struggles that I just mentioned to you. And I want you to address each and every single one of them in your unit training plan. I want you to develop, train, then retrain those distro platoons and put them on the road. Give them the distance. Don't replicate it. Hold them to account and train them to standard because they're going to be critical to be able to enable the distances that we're going to have to operate here in the future. In the staff in particular, wargame with the S4 in order to develop the branch plans in the event that one of your FARPs is fouled or destroyed, and that sequel in the event that we have experienced success and now we need to push them a resupply. Develop through wargaming a decision support matrix and then use that decision support matrix in your rehearsals at echelon to ensure we understand what happens in the likely and the catastrophic risk that we'll see if those FARPs are destroyed. And then finally, to help us transition to command and control, make sure that there is a good C2 plan, a comms pace plan that enables over-the-horizon comms with that FARP team in order for them to be able to be at the right place at the right time to enable your operations. Now I'm going to transition to the command and control warfighting function that is also challenged once we start operating aviation at distance. I'm going to start with FM30, where it clearly states that the division is a principal warfighting function during large-scale combat operations. And there is an absolute clear role in Army aviation, particularly alongside our artillery brothers, to help the division shape kinetically their deep fight. Based on our observations, aviation formations are highly successful in conducting deep operations, particularly when we have windows where we've converged enablers across all domains. Aviation is fairly adept at massing our combat power in the division's closest close fight at the decisive time and place of the division's choosing, oftentimes when we combine arms with the BCT. But this comes with a caveat. So long as we address the C2 challenges that exist while we're operating 150 kilometers displaced from our BCT. So a BCT's operational timeline is much more condensed when they are in contact. Oftentimes, a BCT will go from mission analysis all the way through rehearsals within a 24-hour period. And that's what's necessary for them to be able to continue their operations. But what that also prevents is the coherent integration of aviation into their scheme of maneuver and into their sustainment. And so oftentimes what we'll see is the BCT's plan does not include aviation as a maneuver or aviation to support their sustainment. The unit airspace plans are not developed, sent, and established in the ACO in time, and there's non-lethal and lethal seed is not laid on to enable those aviation operations. And it's not because the BCT is full of incompetent people who are not committed. That's certainly not the case. They're highly capable at executing the operations process. What it is that LSCO demands a specific pace of operations in order for them to remain relevant. If that's the BCT in general, I'm now talking about the Brigade Aviation Officer. And for many, many valid reasons, manning being the number one reason, oftentimes BAOs are not assigned to those BCTs. And if they are assigned, and if they are capable of conducting that job and they're proficient, they oftentimes are found in CHOPS conducting a different job. And if it's the opposite, we still lack the coherent integration of aviation into a scheme of maneuver or sustainment. So the end state still remains the same. And now going to the aviation battalion, our battalions and squadrons are MTO'd only one STT and CPM. About half of those units arrive with that piece of equipment that is inoperable before they even get in the box. And if it is, it's either damaged jumping into the box or jumping within the box. And that forces the aviation task force to now revert to only one of two JCR TAC kits that's on their MTO in order for them to be able to communicate, coordinate with all of the counterparts in every warfighting function in the BCT and the division level. And as we take a look at all these challenges that prohibit aviation integration into BCT scheme maneuver at 150 kilometer distance, we can start to see that an LNO alone in the BCT is not sufficient really, regardless of how strong he or she is, to be able to synchronize aviation operations for the BCT in that time-constrained environment. So what we've observed here at the National Training Center, when a unit is tasked to support the division's close fight, we oftentimes struggle in incorporating aviation in the scheme of maneuver and also the sustainment. What we oftentimes see is that lethal or non-lethal seed is not laid on, and if it is, it's not effective. We also see that fratricide has an increased potential when we have it integrated intelligently with a BCT. An incoherent airspace plan that enables the responsiveness of fires and the maneuver of aviation does not exist, causing friction. Crews are unaware of not only their mission, but the enemy SID temp and the friendly SID temp prior to taking off. The perceived op tempo of aviation trying to keep up with a BCT at 150 kilometers away with only a JBCP or a JCR TAC kit to communicate places us in a position where we are unable to coherently combine arms with that BCT. The good news story is that this only occurs when we're operating with that same construct that I just mentioned with an LNO. But what we have also observed is that when an aviation task force commits a robust TAC, in this case we'll call it a TAC plus or a main minus, and we displace that element, that C2 node, and nest them under the BCT 150 kilometers forward, and we're able to now integrate our aviation leaders with their counterparts at the BCT, what we'll find is exact opposite effect. The aviation commander has a seat at that table and is able to provide counsel to that BCT commander in the best employment of his or her combat formation. The operations officer is able to nest and shape the BCT's operations and plans before those orders are cut and send back warnos and op orders that allow troops in the rear to conduct their troop leading procedures and provide bottom-up refinement and send those forward in order to set the conditions for the aviation scheme maneuver. We see unit airspace plans come into effect that enable the responsiveness of fires, the maneuver of aviation. We see lethal and non-lethal seed come into fruition, this time efficiently and effectively. And ultimately, the aviation's perceived op tempo decreases to a point where we're able to coherently combine arms with that BCT. So ladies and gentlemen, I've given you a tremendous amount over the last 15 minutes. And so this will close out the first part of this three-part series. In the next part, we're going to talk about how we're performing in an IADS environment. In addition to that, we're going to talk about our leg day, what we're doing to deliberately train our staffs to be successful. And on the third and final part, I will share with you those 7 critical lessons that I've learned. So please stay tuned for those other 2 parts that are coming out. If anything that I've shared with you is of interest to you, we have likely written an article about it. If you want to go there, the link to our SharePoint page. And so long as you have a CAT card, you can get into those articles that we publish on a monthly basis in our Eagle Eye newsletter. Until then, thank you for your time. Train the force.